James Riddle Hoffa, also known as Jimmy, was born on February 14th, 1913 and vanished without a trace on July 30th, 1975. He was an American labor union leader who served as the president of the International Brotherhood of Teamsters from 1957 until 1971. Jimmy was notorious for his unapologetic ties with organized crime figures and for his hot-headed short temper. The mystery surrounding his disappearance keeps his name alive and well today, almost 50 years later. There are many theories as to what really happened to him and who was involved, but we'll most likely never know the entire truth. What we can figure out, however, is just exactly who Jimmy Hoffa was and the actions that subsequently led to his downfall and ultimately his disappearance. Jimmy Hoffa was born on Valentine's Day in the small town of Brazil located in southern Indiana. His father was a man of German descent named John, and his mother was an Irish clothes washer named Viola. John worked in the coal mines until his death in 1920 when Hoffa was only 7 years old, and his mother moved him and his family to Detroit 4 years later in 1924. Jimmy would end up dropping out of school 7 years later at the age of 14 to focus on working full-time to help support the family. He mainly worked manual labor jobs that paid poorly and were often very brutal conditions to work in. It wasn't until 1932, when Jimmy was 19, that he did something that earned him the respect and leadership position of his fellow workers. He organized his first strike against the Kroger chain they were working for. As a means to increase their wages, Hoffa and his workers refused to work in protest for higher wages. The protest paid off, and the Kroger chain increased the wages for its workers. After having a falling out with an abusive shift foreman, Hoffa quit the Kroger chain and was invited to become an organizer for the local 299 Teamsters Union in Detroit. For the next 2 decades, Jimmy consolidated local union trucker groups into regional sections which then formed into a national body. The union membership was steadily growing, increasing to 170,000 members by 1936 and then to 420,000 members just an additional 3 years later in 1939. Hoffa played a major role in helping the Teamsters organize truck drivers and warehousemen throughout the Midwest and eventually nationwide. He used quickie strikes, secondary boycotts, and other means of leveraging union strength at one company, organized working at another, and eventually winning contract demands at other companies. This was a lengthy process that started in the 1930s, but over the years helped bring the Teamsters to be one of the most powerful unions in the United States. As the years progressed throughout World War II, the Teamster membership grew exponentially and had grown to over 1 million members in the post-war boom by 1951. The main issue with this is that Hoffa made arrangements with gangsters from the Detroit area to help unify and expand trucking unions. He would hire muscle from the mafia to help them win the wars against the corporations that were against unionizing. He also supposedly asked Santo Perone, a mafia kingpin, to hold his goons back so that the Teamsters could win the union memberships. In 1952, Jimmy was selected as National Vice President of the Teamsters by Dave Beck, the incoming president. Beck would go on to be indicted for fraud 5 years later in 1957, and Jimmy took over as the president of the Teamsters. With him as president, he was able to approve loans from the Teamsters Pension Fund that helped provide large amounts of cash that helped mobsters and organized crime figures build their casinos and resorts on the Las Vegas Strip. It was also in 1957 that Hoffa was arrested for trying to bribe an aide to the McClellan Committee. Although he was acquitted, this was enough to trigger more investigations into union corruption by Robert Kennedy, who served as counsel for the McClellan Committee. Around the same time, an AFL-CIO convention was being held in Atlantic City, New Jersey, where union members voted almost 5-1 to expel the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. With the odds beginning to stack against him, Jimmy Hoffa still managed to be re-elected as the Teamsters president in 1961. He worked to expand the union in the following years and achieved his biggest accomplishment as the Teamsters president in 1964 when he successfully brought 99% of over-the-road truckers in North America under a single national master freight agreement. His feeling of victory was short-lived, however, as he was being thoroughly investigated throughout the majority of the late 50s and early 60s. Bobby Kennedy would end up putting together a Get Hoffa squad which worked around the clock to put Jimmy in prison, and in 1963, they were able to indict him for jury tampering in Nashville. He was convicted a year later in 1964 and sentenced to 8 years in prison. While out on bail during his appeal, he was convicted of improper use of the Teamsters pension fund, along with conspiracy, during a separate trial in Chicago and sentenced to an additional 5 years in prison. After spending the next 3 years trying to appeal his convictions to no avail, Jimmy Hoffa began serving his 13-year prison sentence on March 7, 1967, at the Lewisburg Federal Penitentiary in Pennsylvania. He resigned as the Teamsters president on June 19, 1971, and Frank Fitzsimmons was elected as his replacement just a few weeks later on July 9th. Things got more complicated for Hoffa while he was incarcerated due to being housed with Anthony Provenzano, aka Tony Pro, who was a cap regime, or mob captain, in the Genovese crime family. When Tony Pro approached Jimmy and asked about his problem with his pension, the two got into a physical altercation in which Hoffa was quoted as yelling, "It's guys like you that got me in here in the first place." When Jimmy Hoffa was released from prison on December 23, 1971, thanks to a presidential pardon by Richard Nixon, the only thing on his mind was getting back into his leadership role of the Teamsters by any means necessary. This was met with heavy opposition and resistance from several members of the Mafia, including Tony Pro, who had threatened to rip out Hoffa's guts or kidnap his grandchildren when he asked for Pro's endorsement. Despite the many attempts and warnings to get Hoffa to back down, he stood his ground and was extremely relentless. Two other prominent Mafia figures, named Anthony Giacalone and his younger brother Vito, had become involved and served as the mediators between Jimmy Hoffa and Tony Pro. The Giacalone brothers were able to eventually convince Hoffa to agree to a public meeting between Anthony Giacalone and Tony Provenzano. The meeting was to take place on July 30th, 1975 at 2 p.m. at the Machus Red Fox restaurant in Bloomfield Township, Michigan. Hoffa left his home around 1:15 p.m. on July 30th, 1975 and stopped at the office of his friend Louis Linto to let him know where he was going. Louis had already gone to lunch, so Hoffa waited around for a few minutes before leaving a message for him and heading toward the Machus Red Fox. He arrived around 2 p.m. and waited patiently inside the restaurant before realizing he had been stood up. Annoyed and frustrated, Jimmy went outside to the parking lot around 2:15 p.m. and used a payphone to make a call to his wife, informing her that he would be headed home soon. After getting off the phone with her, Hoffa chatted with a few people in the parking lot who recognized him before starting to make his way back to his car. Around 2:30 p.m., he was last spotted getting into a car that was reportedly occupied by 3 men who proceeded to drive away down Telegraph Road. From that day forward, Jimmy Hoffa was never seen again.